Baudrillard. Baudrillard? Oh, hi there. I'm not usually one for follow-up videos, but in this case, I thought it was necessary. My last video on postmodernism had hundreds and hundreds of comments, which basically told me two things. One, people really don't like how I say Baudrillard. And two, there's a far more sinister side to postmodernism that I was unaware of that warrants further investigation. So in this video, I want to do two things. Number one, I want to really take a more holistic look as to what postmodernism really is, but more importantly, I want to look at what it isn't. And two, I want to prove that I do know how to say Baudrillard, but I just sound a bit silly when I do it French. Baudrillard. Now, before we begin today's video, I want to spend a fraction of our time talking about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online community of super talented filmmakers, cooks, craftspeople, tech heads. Any skill you can imagine, you'll find it on Skillshare. One of the courses I've recently taken was Learn to Paint Watercolor by Will Elliston. I'm always looking for ways to unwind when I'm not teaching or if I'm isolating again with COVID, so I started trying my hand at watercolor. The course covers everything from light sketches to adding textures and even painting eyes. It's just one example of the many skills that you can pick up using Skillshare. If you're interested in joining this amazing community of people sharing their skills online, follow the link in the description below and the first 1,000 people to click it will get a 30-day free trial. So back to today's video. I want to start off by giving you a little bit of my context, which I think will explain a little bit of my definition of postmodernism in my previous video, which if you haven't seen it, you can watch right here. I teach media studies, and one of the concepts that we have to teach is postmodernism. Now, a lot of people commented that I glossed over some of the key elements or I entirely missed parts out, and those people are entirely correct. Postmodernism is huge, it's absolutely massive. The part that I cover in my work is Baudrillard's concepts of postmodernism. But the limitations of my definition kind of illustrate just why postmodernism is such a minefield. It manifests completely differently in different areas of research, be it architecture, music, sociology. They're all branches of the same postmodernism tree, but they apply it slightly differently. So I guess the first thing I want to do is take a step back from that very specific branch of cultural postmodernism that I spoke about in my previous video and look back at it more as an umbrella term for all the different things that postmodernism can be in various different academic branches. Okay, so here we go. You may remember I started off by defining the pre-modern era, which is basically where religion provided a single grand narrative for society to follow. A grand narrative being an ideology or a belief system which tells you about how you should live, what's good, what's bad, what you shouldn't do, how you should behave, and everyone was reading from the same hymn sheet. Nice and simple. This is followed by modernism, which coincides with the Enlightenment and technology, science, the death of God. This offered an explosion of new grand narratives, not just that of religion, based on scientific observation, and it was headed up by some of the great thinkers of the time like Darwin and Marx. So if we go back to postmodernism, which is what comes after all of these grand narratives, to give you a more broad definition than my last one, it refers to the skepticism we now have for all of these grand narratives, having been surrounded by so many in the modernist era. Essentially what it means is with so many grand narratives on offer, there can't be one single truth. They can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways. In other words, postmodernism is the condition of having lost faith in the structures offered by modern academics. And so we seek answers instead in micro-narratives, our own lived experiences. This realization leads to far more individualism and self-reflectivity, key components of postmodernism. So now that we've got this very broad definition of postmodernism, which is skepticism toward established structures, if we go back down my very specific area of study, which is culture and media, what we see is the use of metatextuality.
He doesn't mean that.
Intertextuality. Parody of modernism's seriousness. Non-linear narratives. Hyperreality, and so on. You can see I've personally always seen postmodernism as a sort of playful, self-aware manifestation of culture, which feels almost unbound, unreliant on structure. So that is, as broadly speaking as possible, how I would define postmodernism. Naturally, it draws a lot of comparisons to nihilism, even anarchy, but at the end of the day, it's the result of being surrounded by so much noise, which is worse than ever at the moment with the media and the internet. Eventually, we stop listening and turn inwards. So if that's what postmodernism is, what isn't it? The version of it I saw glimpses of in my comments was very different. Postmodernism equals Marxism. Ask Jordan Peterson. So drag queens and transgenders are very postmodern. Postmodernism is pure evil. Jordan Peterson says it means to be trans and communist because there isn't anything real except power hierarchies, and all ideas are the result of people trying to make stuff up. All of these comments pointed towards the more philosophical side of postmodernism, and the one name that kept coming up more and more often was Jordan Peterson, who, of course, I was already aware of, but only in so much as a figure of controversy, which I usually try to avoid online. Well, in the interest of my own learning and understanding of postmodernism, and to try and find out why postmodernism seemed to be making so many people so angry, I've watched a lot of Jordan Peterson's work on postmodernism, and I can categorically say he is an incredibly intelligent academic with a great deal of understanding in the philosophical side of postmodernism, far beyond my understanding. I've also found him to be inspirational in his ability to communicate. He can quite clearly influence millions. But something that has really bothered me, I think, is the way I feel he has hijacked the word postmodernism purely as a tool in his argument of left versus right. Now, I've watched quite a lot of his videos and listened to quite a few of his podcasts, specifically ones about postmodernism. But I want to focus specifically on one lecture of his, which I will link in the description below, titled Why You Need to Fight Postmodernism, which in itself immediately sets a very confrontational tone that I wasn't expecting. Here's what I have observed about Peterson's use of postmodernism as simply as I can phrase it. Peterson appears to use postmodernism as a label for anyone with progressive, individualist, left-leaning views in an attempt to discredit their non-traditional beliefs in social discourses by making them seem anti-authoritarian and snake-like extremists. You're probably thinking that sounds very colourful and embellished, but listen to this.
And if you're in the predator group, which means you're an oppressor, then you better look out because you're not exactly welcome. And neither are your ideas. You young people that are out there who are university students, you need to take over the student unions. You need to take them back because they're absolute snake pits, and they have been since the 1990s.
The result of his very, very passionate lectures, I fear, is increasing divisions between those who value traditional grand narratives and those who are more progressive or individual. It's a really toxic battle that I've been aware of from the sidelines for some time, but very much tried to stay away from. Now, on that point, before we go on, I just want to state absolutely clearly, I have no interest in entering the debate of left versus right. My interest is purely in how I feel Jordan has very cleverly used postmodernism as an academic tool, almost weaponized it, to give academic weight to his argument online. Now, one of the first things I noticed in this particular seminar is his use of language, which is not surprising as he is clearly a very talented linguist, a huge appreciation for language. But it seems strange to me that almost in the same sentence where he states that language is
the power of words, of course, because ideas are expressed in words, but
he then goes on to use these very, very specific words to describe postmodernists.
A pervasive, pernicious, nihilistic, possessed head trickster doesn't have a shred of gratitude, pathologically wrong with resentment, arrogance, and deceit.
I'm sorry, are we talking about postmodernism here or terrorism by the sounds of it? His use of such inflammatory emotive language is something I'm only really used to seeing in tabloids, and you can see the fire behind it that would get people quite riled up. But if you take a step further, you'll notice he uses very specifically the word postmodernist, that label I spoke about earlier, more as if it was a name for an activist group who are trying to bring down the government, as opposed to an academic concept, which is certainly all I've ever known it as. So who are these postmodernists? Well, he actually introduces them by comparing them to the failed communist states that practiced Marxism, immediately planting the seeds of doubt and distrust of places like the Soviet Union.
And it's a post-Marxist sleight of hand, right? The old Marxist notion was that the world was a battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Now, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely true to say that postmodernism has its roots in Marxism. Marxism was a rejection of capitalist ideologies. But the way that he seems to exclusively use that comparison makes it seem like it is just a rebranded version of communism. Whereas, as we've already seen, postmodernism is so much more than that. It's many, many different things in different academic fields. And I think this is what really surprised me in all of the comments for my last video about postmodernism, is rather than it being something as a cultural phenomenon, I wasn't quite prepared to see how many people felt very angry and upset about this concept. Until I found out that it had been almost sold to them more as a modern day version of communism. He then goes on to build an argument that, unlike communists who were all about the imbalance of power between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, postmodernists look for inequalities anywhere they can, basically making them seem like victims who were looking for some kind of entitlement.
The postmodernist Marxists just basically pulled a sleight of hand and said, okay, if it's not the poor against the rich, it's the oppressed against the oppressor. We'll just redivide the subpopulations in ways that make our bloody philosophy continue in its movement forward, and that's where we're at now.
He indicates the inequalities in gender, sexuality. Lots of trans issues seem to come quite a lot. They are all examples of a postmodern individualist interpretation of how these should appear in society, kind of rejecting the more conservative traditional side of things and turning them into an imbalance of power so that we can get angry at whoever is at the top. Now, it seems to me, certainly from just my perspective of what I've seen so far, that that's perhaps one of the beauties of postmodernism, is that it encourages people to challenge established ways of thinking and to think themselves, to be individualist with their micro-narratives and to question how Christianity or how capitalism works. From what I've seen, Peterson has very much an agenda to preserve traditions of things like Christianity, which is absolutely fine. But I suppose his genius with the way he's used postmodernism and compared it to communism is that it almost intercepts anyone's arguments before they can even begin, because it makes them seem like victims who are just whinging for the sake of it. But he then goes on to kind of undermine individual thinkers, non-academics, by pointing out that with such a complex area, which postmodernism most definitely is, I'll hold my hand up and say I'm still learning. He indicates that half the people who play around with this term are not truly intelligent enough to grasp it and have learnt it through secondhand discourses online.
And it's not like any given person is absolutely possessed, say, by the spirit of postmodernism, because often they're not educated enough to know all the details about what it is that has them in their grip.
So he's suggesting people are playing with these very complex concepts such as Marxism, and it sounds very much like stand up to the man, but they don't really know what they're getting at. Well, I'd kind of say this is true, but I'd say it's also true of his very, very loyal followers who now have an interpretation of postmodernism which is purely learned from his extensive library of videos. And unfortunately, like I'm trying to illustrate with this video, he's weaponizing it. He's kind of feeding the fire and making it seem like a fight that needs to be fought. So on the one hand, we have the postmodernists who are learning about postmodernism, and through their investigation into things like Marxism, they are finding meaning in reality based on their own lived experience and their own perceptions, their own micro-narratives. And then on the other hand, we've got the more traditionalist, you might say conservative thinkers, whose knowledge and understanding of postmodernism comes from, I would argue, the very inflammatory version of postmodernism, which we see from Peterson, which is absolutely everywhere. And I'm worried that that version is causing such huge divisions. The online is a really toxic place, you're probably aware. I think this argument I've seen online that lived experience is not tangible evidence, therefore it should be discredited, that kind of prohibits anyone without a degree, or a master's or a doctorate, from entering the debate. Well, that sounds kind of elitist to me. What would you say? Finally, one of the things he does in this video which really wound me up was he basically insinuated that grand buildings like the auditorium he's speaking in and, you know, the many brilliant accomplishments we've had in the world are completely discredited and not valued by postmodernists, again, to use that label. Watch this clip to see what I mean.
The first thing that you might want to note about postmodernism is that it doesn't have a shred of gratitude. And there's something pathologically wrong with a person who doesn't have any gratitude, especially when they live in what so far is the best of all possible worlds. And Western societies have been absolutely remarkable in their ability to generate and distribute wealth, as you can tell by just looking around and taking a brief bit of consideration for the absolute miracle that even a building like this represents. You don't apologize to these people. That's a big mistake. Apology, they read apology as an admission of guilt. You don't apologize and you don't back down.
I feel like in this argument, what he's done is he has very, very cleverly labeled anyone with a left ideology or anyone who's oppositional to hierarchy or traditional grand narratives as neo-Marxists, who aren't grateful for things like the amazing building that he speaks of. And ultimately what he does is he represents them as a threat to and oppositional to conservative American values. That's not postmodernism. So to summarize, I feel, having done a fair bit of research and really entering this from the outside, that Peterson has given postmodernism a bad name. He's presented it in such a way to give academic weight to his defense of conservatism. And what he's managed to do with a very, very cleverly constructed argument is simultaneously discredit non-academics with the intelligence to grasp postmodernism, but also only presented the parts of it which have their roots in Marxism. So anyone who's learned about it from him isn't getting the full picture either. My biggest gripe is that I feel like he's just adding fuel to the fire, which is where even I'm aware of this huge gulf between left and right now. Guys, I realise that this is a very, very hot topic and people are very, very passionate about it, but I suppose my intention with this video is to remove the taboo from the idea of postmodernism, which from what I can see has been kind of constructed by Peterson. Postmodernism is a very, very interesting academic idea, one that I've always loved talking about, and I guess I just didn't like to see the way it's being used to fuel the fire of the culture wars. As always, I'll be very interested to see what you have to say about this. Thank you very much for watching, as always, and I will see you next time.